The Ego and the ID 1923. The present discussions are a further development of some trains of thought which I opened up in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, 1920G, and to which, as I remarked there, my attitude was one of a kind of benevolent curiosity. In the following pages, these thoughts are linked to various facts of analytic observation, and an attempt is made to arrive at new conclusions from this conjunction. In the present work, however, there are no fresh borrowings from biology, and on that account it stands closer to psychoanalysis than does Beyond the Pleasure Principle. It is more in the nature of a synthesis than of a speculation, and seems to have had an ambitious aim in view. I am conscious, however, that it does not go beyond the roughest outline, and with that limitation I am perfectly content. In these pages things are touched on which have not yet been the subject of psychoanalytic consideration, and it has not been possible to avoid trenching upon some theories which have been put forward by non-analysts or by former analysts on their retreat from analysis. I have elsewhere always been ready to acknowledge what I owe to other workers, but in this instance I feel burdened by no such debt of gratitude. If psychoanalysis has not hitherto shown its appreciation of certain things, this has never been because it overlooked their achievement or sought to deny their importance, but because it followed a particular path, which had not yet led so far. And finally, when it has reached them, things have a different look to it from what they have to others. The two classes of instincts. We have already said that, if the differentiation we have made of the mind into an ID, an ego, and a superego represents any advance in our knowledge, it ought to enable us to understand more thoroughly the dynamic relations within the mind, and to describe them more clearly. We have also already concluded that the ego is especially under the influence of perception, and that, speaking broadly, perceptions may be said to have the same significance for the ego as instincts have for the ID. At the same time, the ego is subject to the influence of the instincts, too, like the ID, of which it is, as we know, only a specially modified part. I have lately developed a view of the instincts, superscript 1, which I shall here hold to and take as the basis of my further discussions. According to this view, we have to distinguish two classes of instincts, one of which, the sexual instincts or eros, is by far the more conspicuous and accessible to study. It comprises not merely the uninhibited sexual instinct proper and the instinctual impulses of an aim-inhibited or sublimated nature derived from it, but also the self-preservative instinct, which must be assigned to the ego, and which at the beginning of our analytic work we had good reason for contrasting with the sexual object instincts. The second class of instincts was not so easy to point to. In the end we came to recognize sadism as its representative. On the basis of theoretical considerations, supported by biology, we put forward the hypothesis of a death instinct, the task of which is to lead organic life back into the inanimate state. On the other hand, we suppose that eros, by bringing about a more and more far-reaching combination of the particles into which living substance is dispersed, aims at complicating life and at the same time, of course, at preserving it. Acting in this way, both the instincts would be conservative in the strictest sense of the word, since both would be endeavoring to re-establish a state of things that was disturbed by the emergence of life. The emergence of life would thus be the cause of the continuance of life and also at the same time of the striving towards death, and life itself would be a conflict and compromise between these two trends. The problem of the origin of life would remain a cosmological one, and the problem of the goal and purpose of life would be answered dualistically. On this view, a special physiological process, of anabolism of catabolism, would be associated with each of the two classes of instincts. Both kinds of instinct would be active in every particle of living substance, though in unequal proportions, so that some one substance might be the principal representative of eros. This hypothesis throws no light whatever upon the manner in which the two classes of instincts are fused, blended, and alloyed with each other, but that this takes place regularly and very extensively is an assumption indispensable to our conception. It appears that, as a result of the combination of unicellular organisms into multicellular forms of life, the death instinct of the single cell can successfully be neutralized and the destructive impulses be diverted onto the external world through the instrumentality of a special organ. This special organ would seem to be the muscular apparatus, and the death instinct would thus seem to express itself, though probably only in part, as an instinct of destruction directed against the external world and other organisms. Once we have admitted the idea of a fusion of the two classes of instincts with each other, the possibility of a more or less complete diffusion of them forces itself upon us. The sadistic component of the sexual instinct would be a classical example of a serviceable instinctual fusion, and the sadism which has made itself independent as a perversion would be typical of a diffusion, though not of one carried to extremes. From this point we obtain a view of a great domain of facts which has not before been considered in this light. We perceive that for purposes of discharge the instinct of destruction is habitually brought into the service of Eros. We suspect that the epileptic fit is a product and indication of an instinctual diffusion, and we come to understand that instinctual diffusion and the marked emergence of the death instinct call for particular consideration among the effects of some severe neuroses, for instance, the obsessional neuroses. Making a swift generalization, we might conjecture that the essence of a regression of libido, e.g. from the genital to the sadistic anal phase, lies in a diffusion of instincts, just as, conversely, the advance from the earlier phase to the definitive genital one would be conditioned by an accession of erotic components. The question also arises whether ordinary ambivalence, which is so often unusually strong in the constitutional disposition to neurosis, should not be regarded as the product of a diffusion. Ambivalence, however, is such a fundamental phenomenon that it more probably represents an instinctual fusion that has not been completed. It is natural that we should turn with interest to inquire whether there may not be instructive connections to be traced between the structures we have assumed to exist, the ego, the superego, and the ID on the one hand and the two classes of instincts on the other, and, further, whether the pleasure principle which dominates mental processes can be shown to have any constant relation both to the two classes of instincts and to these differentiations which we have drawn in the mind. But before we discuss this, we must clear away a doubt which arises concerning the terms in which the problem itself is stated. There is, it is true, no doubt about the pleasure principle, and the differentiation within the ego has good clinical justification, but the distinction between the two classes of instincts does not seem sufficiently assured, and it is possible that facts of clinical analysis may be found which will do away with its pretension. One such fact there appears to be. For the opposition between the two classes of instincts we may put the polarity of love and hate. There is no difficulty in finding a representative of Eros, but we must be grateful that we can find a representative of the elusive death instinct in the instinct of destruction, to which hate points the way. Now, clinical observation shows not only that love is with unexpected regularity accompanied by hate, ambivalence, and not only that in human relationships hate is frequently a forerunner of love, but also that in a number of circumstances hate changes into love and love into hate. If this change is more than a mere succession in time, if, that is, one of them actually turns into the other, then clearly the ground is cut away from under a distinction so fundamental as that between erotic instincts and death instincts, one which presupposes physiological processes running in opposite directions. Now, the case in which someone first loves and then hates the same person, or the reverse, because that person has given him cause for doing so, has obviously nothing to do with our problem. Nor has the other case, in which feelings of love that have not yet become manifest express themselves to begin with by hostility and aggressive tendencies, for it may be that here the destructive component in the object cathexis has hurried on ahead and is only later on joined by the erotic one. But we know of several instances in the psychology of the neuroses in which it is more plausible to suppose that a transformation does take place. In persecutory paranoia, the patient fends off an excessively strong homosexual attachment to some particular person in a special way, and as a result this person whom he loved most becomes a persecutor, against whom the patient directs an often dangerous aggressiveness. Here we have a right to interpolate a previous phase, which has transformed the love into hate. In the case of the origin of homosexuality, and of desexualized social feelings as well, analytic investigation has only recently taught us to recognize that violent feelings of rivalry are present which lead to aggressive inclinations, and that it is only after these have been surmounted that the formerly hated object becomes the loved one or gives rise to an identification. The question arises whether in these instances we are to assume a direct transformation of hate into love. It is clear that here the changes are purely internal, and an alteration in the behavior of the object plays no part in them. There is another possible mechanism, however, which we have come to know of by analytic investigation of the processes concerned in the change in paranoia. An ambivalent attitude is present from the outset, and the transformation is effected by means of a reactive displacement of cathexis, energy being withdrawn from the erotic impulse and added to the hostile 1.8. Not quite the same thing, but something like it happens when the hostile rivalry leading to homosexuality is overcome. The hostile attitude has no prospect of satisfaction. Consequently, for economic reasons, that is, it is replaced by a loving attitude for which there is more prospect of satisfaction, that is, possibility of discharge. So we see that we are not obliged in any of these cases to assume a direct transformation of hate into love, which would be incompatible with the qualitative distinction between the two classes of instincts. It will be noticed, however, that by introducing this other mechanism of changing love into hate, we have tacitly made another assumption which deserves to be stated explicitly. We have reckoned as though there existed in the mind, whether in the ego or in the ID, a displaceable energy, which, neutral in itself, can be added to a qualitatively differentiated erotic or destructive impulse and augment its total cathexis. Without assuming the existence of a displaceable energy of this kind, we can make no headway. The only question is where it comes from, what it belongs to, and what it signifies. The problem of the quality of instinctual impulses and of its persistence throughout their various vicissitudes is still very obscure and has hardly been attacked up to the present. In the sexual component instincts, which are especially accessible to observation, it is possible to perceive a few processes which are in the same category as what we are discussing. We see, for instance, that some degree of communication exists between the component instincts, that an instinct deriving from one particular erotogenic source can make over its intensity to reinforce another component instinct originating from another source, that the satisfaction of one instinct can take the place of the satisfaction of another, and more facts of the same nature, which must encourage us to venture upon certain hypotheses. In the present discussion, moreover, I am only putting forward a hypothesis. I have no proof to offer. It seems a plausible view that this displaceable and neutral energy, which is no doubt active in both in the ego and in the ID, proceeds from the narcissistic store of libido, that it is desexualized eros. The erotic instincts appear to be altogether more plastic, more readily diverted and displaced than the destructive instincts. From this we can easily go on to assume that this displaceable libido is employed in the service of the pleasure principle to obviate blockages and to facilitate discharge. In this connection, it is easy to observe a certain indifference as to the path along which the discharge takes place, so long as it takes place somehow. We know this trait. It is characteristic of the cathectic processes in the ID. It is found in erotic cathexes, where a peculiar indifference in regard to the object displays itself, and it is especially evident in the transferences arising in analysis, which develop inevitably, irrespective of the persons who are their object. Not long ago, Rank published some good examples of the way in which neurotic acts of revenge can be directed against the wrong people. Such behavior on the part of the unconscious reminds one of the comic story of the three village tailors, one of whom had to be hanged because the only village blacksmith had committed a capital offense. Punishment must be exacted even if it does not fall upon the guilty. It was in studying the dream work that we first came upon this kind of looseness in the displacements brought about by the primary process. In that case, it was the objects that were thus relegated to a position of no more than secondary importance, just as in the case we are now discussing it is the paths of discharge. It would be characteristic of the ego to be more particular about the choice both of an object and of a path of discharge. If this displaceable energy is desexualized libido, it may also be described as sublimated energy, for it would still retain the main purpose of eros, that of uniting and binding, insofar as it helps towards establishing the unity, or tendency to unity, which is particularly characteristic of the ego. If thought processes in the wider sense are to be included among these displacements, then the activity of thinking is also supplied from the sublimation of erotic motive forces. Here we arrive again at the possibility, which has already been discussed, that sublimation may take place regularly through the mediation of the ego. The other case will be recollected, in which the ego deals with the first object cathexes of the ID, and certainly with later ones too, by taking over the libido from them into itself and binding it to the alteration of the ego produced by means of identification. The transformation into ego libido, of course, involves an abandonment of sexual aims, a desexualization. In any case, this throws light upon an important function of the ego in its relation to eros. By thus getting hold of the libido from the object cathexis, setting itself up as sole love object, and desexualizing or sublimating the libido of the ID, the ego is working in opposition to the purposes of eros and placing itself at the service of the opposing instinctual impulses. It has to acquiesce in some of the other object cathexis of the ID. It has, so to speak, to participate in them. We shall come back later to another possible consequence of this activity of the ego. This would seem to imply an important amplification of the theory of narcissism. At the very beginning, all the libido is accumulated in the ID, while the ego is still in process of formation or is still feeble. The ID sends part of this libido out into erotic object cathexis, whereupon the ego, now grown stronger, tries to get hold of this object libido and to force itself on the ID as a love object. The narcissism of the ego is thus a secondary one, which has been withdrawn from objects. Over and over again we find, when we are able to trace instinctual impulses back, that they reveal themselves as derivatives of eros. If it were not for the considerations put forward in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, and ultimately for the sadistic constituents which have attached themselves to eros, we should have difficulty in holding to our fundamental dualistic point of view. But since we cannot escape that view, we are driven to conclude that the death instincts are by their nature mute, and that the clamor of life proceeds for the most part from eros point superscript 1. In fact, on our view, it is through the agency of eros that the destructive instincts that are directed towards the external world have been diverted from the self, and from the struggle against eros. It can hardly be doubted that the pleasure principle serves the ID as a compass in its struggle against the libido, the force that introduces disturbances into the process of life. If it is true that Fechner's principle of constancy governs life, which thus consists of a continuous descent towards death, it is the claims of eros, of the sexual instincts which, in the form of instinctual needs, hold up the falling level and introduce fresh tensions. The ID, guided by the pleasure principle, that is, by the perception of unpleasure, fends off these tensions in various ways. It does so in the first place by complying as swiftly as possible with the demands of the non-desexualized libido, by striving for the satisfaction of the directly sexual trends. But it does so in a far more comprehensive fashion in relation to one particular form of satisfaction in which all component demands converge, by discharge of the sexual substances, which are saturated vehicles, so to speak, of the erotic tensions. The ejection of the sexual substances in the sexual act corresponds in a sense to the separation of soma and germplasm. This accounts for the likeness of the condition that follows complete sexual satisfaction to dying, and for the fact that death coincides with the act of copulation in some of the lower animals. These creatures die in the act of reproduction because, after eros has been eliminated through the process of satisfaction, the death instinct has a free hand for accomplishing its purposes. Finally, as we have seen, the ego, by sublimating some of the libido for itself and its purposes, assists the ID in its work of mastering the tensions.